there we go. There we go. All right. Anyway, so this year we have to outdo Victoria, British Columbia. We need at least 200 people out in the field. We also have this year, we have a new, we're piloting a Richmond Christmas bird count circle. It'll be on Sunday, January 2nd. We already have about 100 people signed up. So another opportunity. If you're not familiar with all of the birding sites in that circle, it ranges from from Richmond all the way almost up to the Carquinez Bridge. And so there's a lot of really interesting birding territory. If you like upland birds, if you like shore birds, there's a little bit for everybody. And it includes Point Melati, which is an area that we are very concerned about. And so I really hope we'll get a good turnout for our first Richmond Christmas bird count. For Eric, Chris, and Dawn have asked me to just put in a little plug for some of their upcoming international travel and national travel. That the Ohio Spring Migration Program is nearly full. We got one space left in Brazil, one space left in Uganda. I think there's a few spaces in Madagascar. I know that the birds, I mean, the wildlife there is pretty spectacular. Please visit us at goldengateaudubon.org, travel with GGAS, and fill out those last slots. We would like to take your birding to the next level and actually create better habitat for birds. We've got a lot of opportunities coming up. Our habitat restoration program has, we have programs throughout November and into December. Golden Gate Park, MLK Shoreline in Oakland. These are great opportunities to help make our habitats better for birds. And we all know that our birds are struggling. All of this work is really important for enhancing the ecosystem services of these places so that they are more resilient, so they sequester carbon better. There's a lot of the work that we're doing not only addresses the biodiversity crisis, but also helps address climate change. So this is really critical work, and we hope that all of you, if you haven't had a chance to go out and join one of our crews, we hope that you'll take a chance now to do it. It's actually a lot of fun. It's what I did in my first day on the job. I joined Heron's Head Park crew out there, and we removed invasive, what was that plant? Sea lavender, Algerian sea lavender, which is taking over from the native sea lavender, and doesn't have as good wildlife value. So getting that out and allowing the native plants to recover is a great thing that we can all help with. This is planting time. So if you have a garden, we encourage you to plant plants for birds. If you can check out the new Gardening for Birds guide or visit our website. We've been working with a group of local nurseries to try and make sure that native plants that are good for birds are available. So we encourage you to visit any of these nurseries and add a few native plants to your garden. They're beautiful, they're easy to grow, and now is the time to plant them. Speaking of which, our next speaker series, Noreen and Eddie, who some of you may know them, they're longtime stalwarts here at Golden Gate Audubon, and they're going to be talking about gardening for birds with native plants, and they've got, as you can see, they've got some great photographs of native birds using native plants for what they do best. It should be a great, informative. They're great presenters. It's an amazing program. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce one of my own personal heroes, Mike Lynes from Audubon, California. For those of you who don't know Mike, he was Golden Gate Audubon's Director of Conservation for about 5 years, not quite, and became Executive Director of Golden Gate Audubon after that, before he joined Audubon California, where he is the Director of Policy. I got that right. Director of Policy. Mike has has experience working in the field as a field ornithologist, and also has a law degree from UC Hastings. So he really knows the birds. He knows public policy, and it has been a real pleasure and privilege for me to get to work with him on projects, particularly lately. Mike has been, was Golden Gate Audubon's lead on Altamont wind farm issues, and is continuing in that role at Audubon California, and has been a mentor and inspiration in that process. So we are so grateful that he was able to join us tonight to talk about climate and birds in California. Oh, before he starts, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will try to monitor it, and if there are questions we can answer as it goes along, we'll answer those, and then we'll go through them at the end. So just go ahead and plop your questions into the chat, and we won't miss them. I promise. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen right now. Great. Hopefully you all can see that, and I'll try to, I'll try to monitor the chat as well, and if questions come up and I can answer them as we're going, I'll do that. But I think maybe Glenn was saying we'll try to hold them towards the end. We'll see what we can do. And thank you for that great introduction. And it's great to be able to come back and speak with Golden Gate Audubon. I joined there in 2008, had been working as an attorney representing nonprofit groups for a few years after law school. But it was really, I went to law school to do bird policy, as my friends like to say. And so being able to come back to Golden Gate Audubon and work on conservation programs and conservation policy was really a gift. And I really appreciated my time there. Getting to work with great people like Alana and Noreen and Eddie and many others. So tonight, and I'll just say a little more about my role, sorry. So now I've been with Audubon California, which is the state office of the National Audubon Society. I've been with them since 2014 as the Director of State Public Policy in California. So I work on both state and federal issues that affect birds and people who care about them in California and their habitats. And it's been a great opportunity to work with National Audubon in that capacity. But yes, I continue to work on Altamont Pass. And so a little bit of what I'll be talking about tonight, I'm really going to focus about Audubon's work on studying the impacts of climate change on birds and what that means, like what our models are telling us and some things that we can do about it. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on Altamont Pass because it touches on a couple of things. One, obviously, renewable energy is a really important resource that's necessary for us to transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources, but it is also fraught with local impacts to wildlife, as we see in the Altamont Pass, where wind turbines there are killing a number of golden eagles that have rendered that population unsustainable and are driving it towards a local extirpation and contributing to an overall decline in golden eagles and many other species. And so how do we, as advocates for birds who understand the impacts that climate change will have on birds and people and the planet, I mean, we care about all these things. How do we balance that need for renewable energy with those local impacts? And that's a balance we have to continue to try to work with. But before I get into talking about the climate change in general, sorry, there we go. And I might have a little bit of lag here when I'm transitioning from slides, so thank you for being patient. I wanted to kind of set the table about where we are at with bird conservation, and I think probably everybody on this, listening to this talk tonight, follows birds enough to know that a couple of years ago there was a report that came out that we have lost about 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. Bird populations have declined by about that amount since 1970. And many of these birds, most of these birds are passerines and shorebirds, including some raptors. And really, there's a lot of reasons why we've lost so many birds. But when it comes down to it, the primary reason that we've lost all these birds in the last 50 years is loss of habitat. In California alone, about 170 years ago, over the last 170 years, we've lost 95% of our inland wetlands and our riparian areas. The most biodiverse zones in California have been lost. That habitat has been lost due to human activities, largely conversion of the natural state over to other uses. And there's so much politics around water and what we've done with water. And so we know where we're at. We've lost habitat. And as Glenn mentioned, before I went to law school, I was a biologist with Point Blue Conservation Science, which is back in my day was Point Reyes Bird Observatory, or PRBO. And I went up and down the valley working in riparian areas and wetlands. I worked in oak woodlands. I worked in coastal scrub. And, what it came down to again and again and again as a conservation biologist is I felt that I was sort of quantifying the obvious, which was these birds don't have enough habitat. And that's why I went to law school, to work on policy to try to get more habitat for these birds and these species. So we know what the problem is, and that's where we're at today. And there's a variety of ways we're trying to address the habitat problems. The habitats that have been affected since 1970, across the board, we've seen declines. I wanted to point out just a few of these here. For Western forest birds down by about 30%, grassland birds down 53% across the country, and many of these species are in the West, very large declines in grassland species. And we continue to lose grasslands and rangelands across the state, both because of conversion to other purposes, because they're poorly managed. And we are, as I will talk about in a moment, projecting even greater losses for grassland species due to the impacts of climate change. And so, we have a real crisis for a lot of the bird populations here. One of the things that the 3 Billion Bird Report told us is that we're not just losing birds that we tend to think of as quote unquote sensitive species. This isn't just about burrowing owls and, California gnatcatcher. It is about things like red-winged blackbirds, lost 92 million red-winged blackbirds since 1970. Now, there's still a lot of red-winged blackbirds around, but when you're losing those kind of numbers, you need to be concerned. Once upon a time, we had millions upon millions of tricolored blackbirds in the state. Now we have fewer than 200,000, and they're on the state threatened list. So we need to be listening to these declines and doing something about them before they worsen. One bright spot, perhaps, in the monitoring of birds over the last 50 years has been actually an increase in waterfowl. And why that is because, frankly, we have provided actively habitat for waterfowl in the 20th century. Even as we were drying up wetlands, we started creating the National Wildlife Refuge, which in the West especially provided habitat for waterfowl. And because they had a built-in constituency of hunters and sports people who were paying large dollars into conservation funds. And the amount of money necessary for conservation, we need to find ways to pay for that. So the National Wildlife Refuge system and the conservation of waterfowl tells us we can conserve for species and we can succeed. As I said, waterfowl, we've seen a 53% increase in many waterfowl populations since that time, since 1970, in part because it provided habitat, in part because DDT was less of a problem and some other factors. And not all waterfowl have benefited to the same extent. I understand it's kind of a gross analogy in some ways, but really we've seen some success and it's laid out some things we can do in the future. So the table's set, we've lost all these birds. Everybody who follows birds, follows natural history, understands that we are in a time globally of crisis. And we've lost a lot of biodiversity and a lot of bird species already, or we put them in severe decline. But then we're faced with this question of what are we looking at over the next century as we understand that climate change is going to fundamentally change the natural systems in California and across the world. And we understand that birds are very sensitive indicators of environmental health. And so that's really where Audubon's report, National Audubon's report around climate change came about. And I'll go through a little bit of what the report was finding, but overall, across the country, Audubon's current estimate is about 389 species are at much greater risk of extinction if we have a 3 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures, if we're not able to reduce emissions and control temperature increases. And I'll step through a little bit of how Audubon formulated this report. And one of the first ways is that they really wanted to figure out or try to give names to a variety of 9 that they're calling existential climate threats to birds. So cropland expansion, fire obviously is a big one, drought, false springs that are causing timing changes in birds, causing them to breed when they shouldn't, perhaps breed too early or breed too late, and then are no longer in sync with insects and other food sources that are necessary to raise their young. And that can cause a real, those kind of disruptions in the natural system that these species evolved over millennia to can cause long-term population impacts for a lot of species. So they looked at all these threats and they started to put together models about how those, as these threats became realized through climate change, they would impact bird populations. The other thing that the Audubon scientists did is they looked at pretty much every data set they could get. And I think a really big shout out to a lot of Audubon participants like you who have participated in CBCs in the past, who participate in a lot of other community science efforts, some as professional scientists, but a lot of it is just coming from people even now reporting into eBird. And I'll note that back when this is now 25 years ago because I'm getting old and rickety, but back when I was at PRBO, we didn't actively often use CBC data, and we didn't have the same kind of access to community science data that folks have now. But there was kind of a feeling like, well, we've got to go out and do these intensive studies that have, methods that can be tested and repeated over and over again with quality control and all the rest in order to get our good understanding of what's happening with birds. And that's loosened up for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is these databases are so big now. They're extremely useful and comprehensive. And so we are able to use a lot of these databases like the CBC, like eBird. eBird is hugely important if you put your data into eBird. That's going in to inform models like Audubon is using here. So this robust data set really set us up to do some really broad scale historic analysis for the first time. The other thing that Audubon did was look at 3 different scenarios, sort of a lower warming scenario of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the secondary one of 2 degrees Celsius, kind of the middle of the road, and the worst case scenario that's now estimated of 3 degrees Celsius, which, 3 degrees at a certain point might actually be optimistic, given the lack of national and times global progress in stemming emissions and the, I will just say the hardcore political opposition to doing more about emissions reduction. But our report in this 389 species that I identified is the species at risk at the highest level, the 3 degree temperature change. And I'll make reference to this as we go through. Sorry, a little bit of lag, there we go. The other thing that they did is they looked at different habitat types. Different habitat types are vulnerable to climate change in different ways. So as you can see up here at the very top, the Arctic species and the boreal forest species are especially sensitive to the impacts of climate change and particularly changing precipitation and changing temperatures and the changing in vegetation that's likely to go with that. Whereas, suburban urban species, generalists, they're in a better space and are likely to be more robust with climate change. Not surprising, but this all went into the model about how Audubon estimated the potential mortality risks for a lot of these species. In California, the results turned out that about 147 out of 307 species identified, those species that we had enough data to really look at, were vulnerable during the summer months at the highest level. So that's that 3 degree temperature range. If we were able to successfully mitigate climate change, then that risk comes down to about 98, which is still not great. We still have a lot of high risks and a lot of problems we've got to deal with birds due to climate change. But we can bring that threat down if we're active in mitigating the impacts of climate change and reducing emissions. That's the main thing I want you to get from this. I mean, there's a lot of orange and red on this slide, but basically red is bad. Those are higher levels of threats. California, particularly in our Central Valley and some parts of the Central Coast, are really under pressure from higher degree, that 3 degree temperature change. So this kind of lends us to what is this model actually producing? And so I pulled out the California quail for a couple of reasons here. One, I love the California quail. And I know from my time working at Golden Gate Audubon, that was a perennial concern of ours about the last California quail in Golden Gate Park. And the last quail in Golden Gate Park didn't disappear, or won't disappear because of climate change per se. It's really a stark example of loss of suitable habitat. Obviously San Francisco is a highly disturbed area and it has a lot of invasive predators like feral cats, and we just haven't provided the kind of habitat that quails need to survive here and be able to survive those kind of disturbances. And I actually went this morning and checked eBird, and someone in the chat might correct me, but I noticed that the last observation for a quail in Golden Gate Park, according to eBird, was June 2018. So it's been, 3 years now, at least since someone registered in eBird that they've seen a California quail. And it's an example of where humans have taken away a prime habitat area where the species was once abundant. And then going over to this right-hand side, or this other side of this chart here, we look at the range lost due to this climate change under the high temperature scenario. And the red indicates a 43% loss of potential range for the California quail. And you'll see that if you look at this map, the red is really up there kind of in mid-range around the ring of the Central Valley, where there still are a lot of quail, but because of all those climate threats that I identified, wildfire, drought, urbanization, a lot of those things, we're likely to see a contraction of the species range. Likewise, that range, this picture doesn't look quite as bad if we're able to reduce emissions to that lower amount. So, there's a little less red in this one, and that there's a more of an indication, this sort of mellow yellow or brown color is it's a little more of a stable habitat type for the quail, which can actually be a fairly resilient species if we are not too disruptive to it. So this is an example of one, we've taken away so much of its habitat already in certain places that's in decline. Two, now we're looking forward to climate change. At the high temperature risk, we see a massive loss of its suitable habitat, a massive decline of its available range. If we reduce that, we do see some reduction, but it's likely going to be more resilient. And that's the kind of thing the model presented over and over again for many of these species. So you can find that, you can find our report at Survival by Degrees if you Google that, and I think it was put in the link earlier in the chat. There's some major takeaways, though, that I want you to take away from where Audubon's report on climate impacts for birds is. And the first one is, as I said, that about 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk or greater risk of extinction due to climate change. And as we say that about birds, obviously Audubon, we're the bird people, but birds are excellent indicators of environmental health. And if we're seeing this kind of vulnerability for bird species, then we know that this is going to apply to many other taxa, for insects, for mammals, for reptiles. And so this lesson of impact we really want to understand. That climate change is presenting a real existential threat for our biodiversity in North America and across the world. The other takeaway that we want you to take from our report is that if we take action now, if we reduce emissions sufficiently, if we build up an appropriately adaptive sort of society in providing for habitat and resilient wildlife populations, we can, improve the chances for about 76% of the species that Audubon has identified through this report. So, all is not lost, and there's still a lot of work that we can do. And very slowly, we're starting to see some political will. Certainly in California, at the national level, a little slower. Internationally, some countries are taking much more aggressive action, which is great. So this really takeaway, what we wanted to identify here was, the number of climate threats. So 305 bird species will face 3 or more of these climate threats. So really lumping together and understanding that there is kind of this cornucopia of threats that are thrust on birds. It's already kind of a hard life to be a bird anyway, but the climate change is exacerbating the impacts of, say, drought or wildfire or unseasonable rains and weather on birds that already have a tough time of it. The other thing we want to note, and I think this is really important to keep in mind, is pretty much every bird species will experience some kind of impact from climate change. And so that even if the species is relatively stable, part of what this is telling us is we need to be sort of building resilience in all our bird populations. And I'll get to some of those solutions in a second. But, this really goes to reinforce some of our real traditional conservation measures, like protecting habitat, restoring habitat, implementing good management practices, because every bird will be affected by climate change, just like every person really will be. So the last takeaway I want to identify here is that it's kind of, as I was saying, we already know a lot of what the tools are. A lot of these are traditional conservation tools. We need to take what we know from our traditional, we as Audubon people leaning on traditional conservation tools, but then also as Audubon people thinking outside of maybe where we as Audubon have weighed in on policy. And I'll give you an example. When I started at Audubon California, we didn't really engage much in talking about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California. Like, we didn't really engage on fossil fuel discussions a lot. And we're still not experts, but we do weigh in on legislation at the state level, for example, that will lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Because we know, as this report is telling us, there is a direct impact about greenhouse gas emissions on our birds, on the things that we're there in Sacramento to talk about on a daily basis. And so, we think about the personal actions we take, and we think about how we use our advocacy tools a little outside the traditional conservation box in order to provide benefits for birds and all our priorities. So I'm just going to quickly, there's the chat, and there's the link in the chat already. But we did create a tool that's available to the public. And if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do it. It's a new web tool where you can go to this website and you can enter in your zip code or your state, and you can actually then go right into your zip code and start identifying different bird species that might be present in your area, and those bird species that we've identified as being of the highest vulnerability. And I'll tell you that this tool has actually been very persuasive. We've shown it to a lot of elected officials. We go into their offices and put in their home zip codes or their district zip codes and show them, here's the birds that are in your district, and here's their vulnerabilities. And then often we can talk about, like, and here, by the way, this is a species that we might find at MLK Regional Shoreline, or that might be along the Richmond shoreline or somewhere else that's really important, and connecting that to a policy ask that we're asking for those decision makers to make to protect or invest in those areas. So anyway, we encourage you guys to use that, take a look at it, and provide us with feedback. And when you do, you can actually call up different species and find out information like this, depending on how large the scope is, how you want to use the tool. Like the yellow-billed magpie, again, a species that is facing a very, at this point, 100% range loss under the model due to the highest 3-degree climate change scenario. Still going to lose a lot, 70% even under the lower one, but with some stability and being able to call what we call sort of climate refugia up there in Sacramento and some of the other areas. The other thing, before we get too into the sort of doom and gloom of this process, is that, yes, the yellow-billed magpie losing all this habitat is galling, and it's a little easy to become despondent. What I want to do with this information is, one, say, look, we can't lose any more yellow-billed magpie habitat to other conversions without adequate mitigations, because this species is going to be in trouble over the next 50 to 100 years. But also, as we're making active conservation decisions, we can try to prioritize in some areas where we know these particularly sensitive species are going to need help. So we can start making some of those investments and strategizing now. And that's my goal, to try to be using these kind of models. So this takes me back to this overall takeaway, which is the 2/3 of North American birds face this great increasing risk of extinction from global temperature rise. And so it really begs the question, what are we going to do about this? And how does Audubon behave in this environment. Oh, sorry, I think it's not advancing the way I want it to. Just a moment. Sorry about that. There we go. So that begs the question, as I said, how does Audubon work to reduce the impacts of climate change? And I mentioned the emissions reductions, working on issues related to carbon sequestration. How do we use, how are we going to be taking carbon out of the air, and how do we do that in a productive way? As we understand and accept the reality of climate change, how do we implement climate adaptation? How does the state get ready for the changes that are before us in a way that considers birds and other wildlife and the needs for access to nature? And how do we, through all of this, maintain healthy and resilient populations of birds, other wildlife, and people? And the people element is really, really important. So I circled here, though, because I'm going to come back to this, which is one of the primary ways that Audubon is working in this field is what's known as nature-based climate solutions. And that is really using nature to do a lot of these issues. We can, in nature-based climate solutions, we can do things that are actually reducing active emissions into the air. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. We can do things that sequester carbon. So they're actually capturing carbon out of the air and sequestering that into trees and into the roots and grass and other plants and other plants. We can be using wetlands to not only sequester carbon, but buffer against climate change from sea level rise and some other impacts. We can have wise vegetation management that reduces the risks of fire and also enhances biodiversity of plants and the birds and other animals that rely on them through vegetation management. So all those things are wrapped up to nature, and we understand that nature is really one of our greatest tools in addressing climate change. There's a lot of different ways I can talk about this. I'll touch on a few, but the main thing I want to talk about for Audubon California is our natural and working lands program. And we often just call it our working lands program. And one of the primary ways that the working lands program has been working over the last several years is improving soil health. And so this often comes around in rangelands, so grazed lands. I'll get to the grazing in a moment. But it can also come in through wetlands or other even farmlands, and how they're managed, where they grow certain crops or they're managed to allow certain plants to grow. Those plants then capture carbon and sequester them into their roots and into the soil over time. And that soil actually can have immense capacity, if it's managed properly, to store carbon. And what we've also found is, as you increase the health of the soil, which stores carbon, it also tends to hold more water. And so on rain events, for example, you start capturing more water into the environment, recreating wetlands, contributing to stream flows, resulting in groundwater recharge in some places. So there is this great cycle that can, with healthy grassland, healthy vegetative areas, where you're actively providing habitat, you're improving soil conditions, you're sequestering carbon, you're capturing more water, which has a ton of additional benefits. And that's really, I would say, the focus again and again of a lot of our work in our natural working lands program, while we're also very focused on how do we help birds actively on things like farmlands and rangelands. So grasslands and rangelands in California, and I'm going to focus on this as one particular type of working land, but certainly there's a multitude of others. But they provide habitat for more than 216 birds, including 50 Audubon priority species and 85 climate vulnerable species, as we've identified in our report. And again, as they store significant amounts of carbon and can capture even more with proper management. The other thing I'll note about good grassland rangeland management, it is much, much more resilient to fire. And as we've seen, that is increasingly important in California, and we know it's especially important for our climate resilience as a state. So that said, there are a whole host of threats to grasslands. We continue to lose grassland habitat in California at a very large rate. Sorry, the number is escaping me at the moment, but it is really about 20, I think it's about 20 to 40,000 acres a year is the number I'm thinking. I'll have to confirm that. but it is a very high number of acres that California continues to lose every year of our rangelands and grasslands. And so as I indicated earlier on, and I'll show it again, we've got a loss of grassland species because we've seen this kind of loss of grasslands and rangelands across the West, and it's continuing, and we haven't figured out how to manage for it all that well. We have a lot of land conversion. There's a lot of California housing going up that's going into the foothills. Invasive species, I know someone just put them in the chat about perennial native grasses, but invasive species coming in. This is a picture of a pig that roots up a lot of native plants and also like blue oaks and native grasses, but also just the invasive weeds, which have been introduced because of ranching and other purposes. And then obviously climate change will present even more risks to these rangelands. So I noted, for example, again, this loss of grassland birds. And to kind of even add a little more on that, bringing it back to the report, as I said, 47% of California's grassland species are vulnerable. Even species like the, fairly ubiquitous meadowlark and horned larks are really, we're really concerned about their loss of habitat and that their numbers will significantly decline because of the loss of rangeland habitat and the compounded effects of climate change. And I see a question about solar in the chat, and I'll talk a little bit about that because that's definitely a land use that we'll want to track. So that brings us to Audubon's conservation ranching program. And I think someone will put a link, or already did put a link in there so if you want to read more about conservation ranching. Let me just preface this by saying, as an old biologist who read a lot of, Edward Abbey and some others back in the 90s when I was working as a biologist, tromping through riparian zones and mountain meadows that had been destroyed by cattle, I am not a booster for grazing a lot of the time. And even when my colleagues at Audubon came to me to start talking about conservation ranching, I was highly skeptical. And I was worried that it might be kind of a greenwashing effort, frankly, by some efforts to kind of legitimize ranching. And I will say, while I remain skeptical as a good lawyer, which is what I am now, and biologist, which is what I was, you should be skeptical. I definitely have been won over and understand the wisdom and many of the tools of why we are implementing conservation ranching. And I'll touch on a few of those. And one is that well-managed rangelands can definitely provide for a lot more bird species, a lot more just taxa in general, and a broader biodiversity of plants and animals, and can lead to much greater soil health. They just have to manage how the cattle are out there, how many cattle, how often they are on a particular parcel of land, keeping them out of sensitive areas like wetlands and like riparian areas. And so, and I'll get a little bit into like what this means when we talk about conservation ranching. So, so the other thing to remember is in the West, we had a lot of grazing animals, not so much in California, but in other places, where we had open grasslands and a lot of grazing animals that went through that were part of the ecosystem, and we had a lot of bird species that evolved along with them. We can, in some places, not everywhere, use cattle to kind of replicate some of those natural processes. And the birds, when we have done that, we've seen real progress in how birds bounce back. And this is just an example of some of the pilot ranches in Missouri where we started conservation ranching. We saw a tripling of bird diversity of species. Certain species went up in much higher numbers. Overall, bird density really increased. They also saw that with a lot of native plants, and indications are with some of the other animal taxa. So right now, National Audubon Society has a conservation ranching program across 15 states. More than 139 ranches are enrolled. I actually think this number has gone up since I wrote down these numbers a little while ago. Over 2 million acres. And part of what conservation ranching does is that when a ranching partner agrees to be, that they want to be in Audubon's conservation ranching program, they agree, and a third party comes in to be verified on all of their practices to make sure that they meet the conservation ranching standards, that they will actually result in a conservation benefit to the lands being grazed. And this is really important for a couple of reasons. Right? Is Audubon doesn't want to be doing this if it's just sort of maintaining the status quo of grazing and ranching, destroying the habitat in the West, as has happened for much of the last couple hundred years. So, so there is a strict protocol. Audubon is not the arbiter of whether they are abiding by that protocol. The rancher is not just self-reporting. There's a third party that comes in to verify that. And that's a really important step in order to have trust in the system, I think. And so the ranchers have to do things like, again, as I said, the number of cattle that they're doing. They have to have a science and monitoring program. Every ranch is kind of its own, has to have its own plan, its own conservation plan. And they, they do monitoring for the number of bird species and how that's changing over time. They need a fence to keep them out of certain sensitive areas. They're identifying threatened and endangered species that are on those properties. The other thing I want to point out about why I've sort of been won over to conservation ranching to an extent is that in California, 50% of the land in California is privately owned. Much of the grasslands and rangelands throughout the West are privately owned. Certainly in California, they are. If we want to save grassland birds, we have to work with private landowners. There's just no alternative. This is not something where someone can just come in and regulate in order to try to save meadowlarks and hornlarks, and we can't hope. It's not a good strategy to wait for things to get put on an endangered species list and then try to save them through severe regulation. So, so I just want to flag that this is really like a. This is a good question actually. What does a rancher get? So, but the importance of being able to work with private landowners and what the rancher gets, and I think we make a reference here about the number of restaurants and retailers that we're already working with is. It's a little like bird-friendly coffee or organic coffee, is they actually get an Audubon imprint that they put on their beef, and then they can sell that to restaurants and to retailers, supermarkets at a premium because this is more sort of bird-friendly beef. And we don't use the term bird-friendly beef, but bird-friendly land that it's coming from. And so, and that is a way so that's sort of the return that the rancher gets. And what we found working with the ranchers that have come to us and wanted to participate in the program is that these are folks that, they want to help take care of the lands that they're working on. And we've had a lot of interest in folks working with us on our Bobcat Ranch property where we do conservation ranching, people coming to us asking to graze their cattle out there and be part of the conservation ranching program. And so our hope is that they will continue to expand this. As you can see, the goal is 2.9 million acres. In California, we're up to 14 ranch operations, over 37 ranches themselves, and 600,000 acres. And we want to continue to expand that as well. The other thing is, if the ranchers are finding this system adequately profitable, that they can remain in business. And ranching is often a very marginal business, believe it or not, at least for those that are doing it ethically. We help those folks stay in business, and they then are better stewards in the land, as opposed to that land being, subdivided into houses or turned into a Walmart, or just grazed so intensively that all ecological value is lost. So that, and a lot of these ranchers want to stay in business, and that's another big part of their motivation. So that's overall sort of the conservation ranching. We ran a piece of legislation last year to create a program with the state of California for it. That bill did not go forward last year, but we are reintroducing it in 2022. And we've had bipartisan support, and we expect that it will go forward. And that will basically create a program at the state of California to encourage and incentivize conservation ranching across the state, or adoption of those principles for conservation ranching in grasslands across the state, which will help bring more resources to the program. So that's just one piece of the working lands element. The other part of the natural working lands I wanted to identify, especially for folks at Golden Gate Audubon, is just the importance of coastal, and I would include bayside restoration. This is a picture from Sonoma Creek, where we did a very large restoration out there to return it to a tidally influenced wetland hugely important for a lot of species along the bay, and also for improving the climate resilience of the bay to sea level rise. Marshes like this out at Sonoma Creek will actually then, as sea level rise comes along, the water is going to wash into there and deposit more sediment. And what we should see is actually a buildup of this marsh slowly over time. That's our hope as well. I know Audubon, Golden Gate Audubon is deeply involved and really helped create the MLK regional shoreline. That's one of the goals out there too as well, is that sediment should accrete in that wetland over time so that it continues to provide habitat for rails and other sensitive species that frankly do not have enough habitat around the bay. And while it's doing that, it's also sequestering carbon, and also usually adjacent to these wetlands, we have healthier subtidal habitats for things like eelgrass. So many of you probably know that along the Richmond shoreline, there's also some major tidal marsh out there. It's also the largest bed of eelgrass, a subtidal seagrass that is hugely important for forage fish like herring and salmon, or not salmon so much, but other fish that breed in the eelgrass that are then fundamental forage fish for birds. We want to basically creating these upland wetland habitats that are really important, and then the subtidal habitats along the coast to sequester carbon and buffer us from climate change. And then where I work most of the time, right, is in Sacramento on statewide policy. I hope some of you have participated in our annual advocacy day. If you have not, I hope that you will this year. Glenn was a huge help last year. And I hope that many of you will join us in June. We will do another advocacy day, likely virtual again, just to be safe with COVID. But in the past, we've actually done it in person, and we hope to do it again in person soon. And if you've never done any kind of advocacy day, it's a great day to learn. You come out, you work with friends or colleagues from Golden Gate Audubon, you get to meet other Audubon folks and meet with your legislators and talk about some important issues like conservation ranching, like conservation in general. And what the work that I do a lot of the time is actually identifying things in the state budget in order to get money for conservation purposes in the state. Last year, in forming the 2021-22 budget, we had an actual significant budget surplus in the state of California despite COVID. So we were able to capture large chunks of money for a lot of different priorities. But I wanted to highlight a few here because it really talks about what we're trying to do around climate change. For nature-based solutions to climate change, in the first year, we had $46 million to start going into nature-based solutions like restoration and different types of habitat and management. We would hope that some of that money will be put towards things like rangeland management and conservation ranching. That's part of our ask to the state right now. Over 3 years, though, the budget negotiations that came out of the state of California last year were they actually made a budget for this current year, and then they promised some additional money in years 2 and 3. So over a 3-year budget, we should have $1.4 billion in nature-based solutions. And Golden Gate Audubon is likely very, could be the recipient of grants should it decide to go after them for some of that money. For example, to do some wetland work, for wetland restoration work or urban stream work in the bay, or even, Golden Gate Audubon might support others, the East Bay Parks or folks on the regional shoreline, to do some of that work as well. So this is money that can come to San Francisco Bay and do some provide some real benefits. Obviously in habitat restoration, state parks are a big plus. And then I mentioned the urban streams and greening. So this is all money that you all could be seeing some changes in San Francisco Bay due to that. So one of the things, this is a little bit of may feel like a little bit of a non sequitur, but Glenn and I wanted to bring this up with folks. Obviously, a major part of reducing emissions is transitioning from a fossil fuel economy to cleaner energy sources. And that includes solar and wind. Now, and I know someone put something in the chat about solar earlier. The issue with solar, for the most part, is that it requires vast tracts of land. And so we are converting a large open space to solar farms, primarily in Southern California. And my colleague, Gary George, who is fantastic, by the way, and you guys should invite him to come talk to you about renewable energy. He's been working on the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan for over 10 years, which is really about haggling about where solar can go down in Southern California in the desert and where it can't, where we need to prioritize conservation. And he was really pivotal in representing Audubon in that process to protect bird habitats down there. We are looking at a change in the Central Valley because of the lack of water in California. We expect about 1 million acres of agricultural land in the state to go out of production because it doesn't have enough water to remain in production. That means in Central Valley in particular, that a lot of land that's currently farmed is going to transition to some other use. And that is a real opportunity to look at solar development on some of these old farmlands with marginal habitat values, where we could be generating large amounts of electricity close to grids. We don't have a lot of transmission lines, which have huge impacts on birds, to at least reduce those transmission lines. That is one area where we're kind of bullish on solar development overall. Solar does have some issues. Obviously, one we worry about is the lake effect, where if there's too much solar out there, it can look like a lake. And then birds like grebes during migration will sometimes land on the solar panels, and then they're incapable of taking off, and then they die. And so those are some real impacts that happen out there, whether it's population level impact or not. There doesn't seem to be evidence indicating that so far. But we do want to see best management practices and mitigation measures implemented to reduce the effect of those impacts on populations affected by things like lake effect from the solar. And certainly where habitat is being displaced for solar, there needs to be adequate mitigation measures. And Audubon's advocacy on solar has always been that we should be avoiding putting solar in the most sensitive habitat areas that can't be replaced. So that brings us really to wind. And those of you that have been tracking Golden Gate Audubon for a lot of time know that, you know, the Altamont Pass, about 45 minutes east of most of you, has been in development since the 1980s. The first round of wind turbines, about 5,000 turbines went up in about a 56 square mile area with no environmental review and no environmental mitigation. And it became very clear very quickly that those turbines were killing thousands upon thousands of birds every year. It was well documented by the late 80s that that was happening, and no mitigation measures were implemented despite them knowing that. In the early 2000s, Alameda County was going to renew the permits for the old turbines without any environmental review and without any environmental mitigation required. They were just going to rubber stamp those old permits until Golden Gate Audubon, Marin Audubon, Santa Clara Valley Audubon, Ohlone Audubon, and Mount Diablo Audubon sued the county. And they said, you know, you have to do an environmental impact report before you can approve these things. And everybody knew that if they did that environmental impact report, that would be laid bare to the public the extent of the environmental impacts, and they would be required to mitigate. And that started a process where they started taking out some of these old turbines and replacing them with new turbines with some mitigation measures. And that replacement process was called repowering. So repowering is just basically the replacement of old turbines with new ones. In many cases, a single new turbine could replace anywhere from 10 to 30 of the old turbines. So it's a lot fewer turbines on the landscape, but the new turbine is much, much larger. So even though we have fewer turbines out there, what we call the rotor swept area, the area that's actually covered by the turbine, is sometimes not that much smaller than all those 30 other turbines, sometimes the same size, sometimes it's even bigger. And what we know now is that that rotor swept area really reflects the risk to birds. It's not all about just the number of turbines. Since my time at Golden Gate Audubon, I've been working with Alameda County to try to implement a settlement agreement that came from that litigation, where Alameda County promised to reduce avian mortality by 50% by 2009, and to implement a conservation plan that would provide a conservation benefit to affected species. Well, I'm sorry to say, about 15 years later, that conservation plan has never been implemented, and we have not reduced bird mortality by 50%. In 2014, the county issued a programmatic environmental impact report, or EIR, PEIR, for repowering in the Altamont Pass. And in that, they said, once we repower, get out all the old turbines, and once we repower to a 450 megawatts worth of wind projects, all these different wind projects adding up to 450 megawatts of energy generation, we will only kill at most 18 golden eagles. And so at that time, I was at Audubon, California by that point, but Audubon, California, Golden Gate Audubon looked at that and they said, look, we don't love that. We don't want, we'd love for no eagles to be killed, But for 450 megawatts of energy, we can live with 18 golden eagles a year being killed, provided there's some mitigation measures. Because what scientists were telling us at the time is that the diablo range of for golden eagles can sustain about the loss of about 50 golden eagles a year and still be a sustainable population. It wouldn't be a population sink. So we kind of made that deal. That was kind of our understanding. We didn't challenge the programmatic EIR. And a number of projects have since been installed. And what became clear within a few years after 2014 was that they were killing a lot more birds than they thought they were in the programmatic EIR. So the environmental consultants that did that EIR vastly underestimated the mortality that was going to occur. As of 2021, they have built about 150 megawatts out of the 450 build out. So we're like almost a third of the way through the build out. They're already killing about 20 golden eagles a year. So they're already exceeding, at 150 megawatts, we're already exceeding the number of dead golden eagles per year. And with the projects that the county has already approved but not been built, the mortality is expected to rise to around 50 golden eagles per year, which is, as I mentioned, the level at which the population is no longer sustainable. So we've been raising this issue all along, telling the county, hey, we're really concerned about this level of mortality. We don't think you should keep approving these projects till we understand how to properly mitigate them. Despite that, the county continues to approve every project that someone puts before it. And this year, the Moquini Ranch project was put before them, and it was particularly problematic. The old Moquini Ranch process, the old turbines, there was about 51 megawatts of energy out there. The new developer, Brookfield, they want to put 80 megawatts out there. So they actually want to increase the number of megawatts, which is really the risk of birds. You can basically characterize the number of megawatt hours that is coming out of a project is really the threat to birds from that project. They want to increase the risk out there. So not only are we already killing more birds than we promised in the PEIR, the county is ready to approve a project that will kill even more birds, to kill up to about 12 golden eagles per year, an additional 12, taking the total mortality to about 62 golden eagles per year in the Altamont Pass, or just in the Alameda side. So we raised these flags. I will say the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the California Attorney General's Office, the East Bay Regional Park District, and independent scientists all put in very significant comment letters to Alameda County, raising issues, asking for mitigation measures. And I'm sorry, I kind of jumped past this. This is where I was talking about the mortality. They put in, experts at all these agencies put in substantive comments, and that for the most part, Brookfield, Alameda County, and their consultant, ICF International, which is a big multinational environmental consulting firm that basically exists to help people do these kind of projects. They just didn't take them. And I'll give you a couple examples. Fish and Wildlife Service has a standard mitigation measure for golden eagles that says you should not put a turbine within 2 miles of an active golden eagle nest. Or if you're going to put one there, you have to curtail it. You have to shut it down during certain parts of the year to protect the breeding eagles. And in the Altamont Pass, the service has made a special exemption to say, well, that can be 1 mile of a buffer, because if they required a 2 mile buffer in the Altamont Pass, it would shut down way too many turbines, and basically Altamont Pass would get shut down. So we've already made a deal in the Altamont Pass to kill more golden eagles because we don't have that same buffer. Brookfield and the county say, no, we'll only do a half mile. We won't do the full mile. So we're saying, hey, that's not what the service already made a compromise for the Altamont, and you're not even accepting that. And so that was a real problem. Likewise, this project bisects a burrowing owl sanctuary, a species of concern that frankly should already be on the endangered species list. This project cuts a sanctuary area in half and is adjacent to a bunch of easements that are dedicated to benefiting biodiversity. And some of these are less than 1/3 of a mile from these areas where they, the turbines are really adjacent to where some of these burrowing owls are. And again, Brookfield and Alameda County would not take the mitigation measures as they were advised by California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Lastly, there was frankly just shenanigans with bats where they changed some of the numbers about bat mortality, and they refused to do some of the science and mitigation measures that DFW recommended around bats. There's a lot of other problems with the EIR about how they describe the baseline. They never even looked at an alternative that would have fewer than 80 megawatts. They just refused to do it because it would be less profitable and they don't want to make less money. And they refused to do it regardless of how whatever mitigation measures would be there. The last thing I'll say about what's happening out there is every single death of a migratory bird in the Altamont Pass is illegal. It violates the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It violates several provisions of the California Department of Fish and Game Code. And it often violates the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which actually has a permit system that the turbine operators could go out and get a permit that would make their take legal if they happen to kill a golden eagle. But no one in the Altamont Pass, not a single operator, has a permit that is available to them for the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Many have applied, but in the case of Brookfield, they don't have one yet, in part because they have refused to agree to the terms that the Fish and Wildlife Service have said would be necessary for them to get a permit. So you have all these illegal violations of state and federal laws that are happening out there where they're killing migratory birds, and you don't have enforcement actions happening by DFW or the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they don't happen, and if you talk to them, they don't happen because of political concerns about coming after a wind company. And these are major industries. I mean, Brookfield is a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. Only one of its concerns is the wind renewable energy side. They brag about how much money they have, and yet they're not willing to invest in this kind of project to do the necessary mitigation measures to reduce the impacts. And there has to be some kind of balance there. And that's really what we're asking for. We asked for that. When the county approved this project, we appealed it to the Board of Supervisors. And unfortunately, the Board of Supervisors rejected our appeal. And so that forced Audubon, and this is the first time that the National Audubon Society or Audubon California has ever litigated over a wind project in California. And I don't know that National Audubon's litigated over a wind project anywhere else, to be honest. Certainly the chapters litigated against the county almost 15 years ago. But in all our time in the Altamont, it's only the second time that the chapters have brought a lawsuit after years and years of trying to work with the county and the companies. So I won't go through all the points. I kind of pointed out many of the problems with the EIR, but Golden Gate Audubon, as a partner with National Audubon and many of the other chapters, has live litigation as of yesterday against Alameda County and the Mokmeni Wind Project. And our hope is that the court will agree with us that this is an inadequate EIR, that they need to do a proper baseline, that they need to do proper mitigation. And we're confident that once they do that, they can have a financially viable project that will produce energy, that will make them a profit, which is their bottom line, but that will also adequately protect birds and not help drive golden eagles towards extirpation in the Altamont Pass, one of their most important parts of the entire eagle range. The densest population of golden eagles in the world is in the Diablo Range, let alone contributing to things like a likely 50% decline in Ori bat populations and many of the other impacts that are happening out there. So I'll leave it at that. We have our litigation. We are hopeful that will have a positive resolution of one sort or another, and that we can, continue to develop responsibly in the Altamont Pass on wind and elsewhere. The other thing I'll just mention, because I know we're a coastal chapter, Audubon is also tracking what's going on in offshore wind. We want to be helpful and supportive, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of birds. There's more birds that live offshore than live onshore in California. And so we need to understand the impacts and understand how to mitigate them, because seabirds are already in trouble due to loss of habitat, loss of forage fish, and climate change. And it would be a shame if we built up the offshore wind without really understanding our stewardship responsibilities and taking care of those species as well, with the understanding that we do need clean energy, and the climate change really does present an existential threat to humans to many communities, especially disadvantaged communities in the Bay Area and across the state and across the world. Like, we have to balance our concerns with birds with those other considerations. We can do those, and the major corporations making billions off these projects can afford to do some environmental mitigation to create that balance. So that's all I've got for today. I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and I can answer some questions, or I'll go back to Glenn and he can let us know what's next.
So we have a few questions to answer. Thank you, Mike. That was great. One of the questions was that I haven't gotten to yet. I think Joshua asked if there was a letter to forward to representatives for this upcoming bill. I think he's referring to the reintroduction of the wetlands bill.
Yes. So what I would suggest, and if anybody, I can put you can find me at Mike Lynes, mike.lynes at audubon.org, or mlynes at audubon.org if you can email me. But if you're not getting Audubon action alerts, and I know you probably get more spam from Audubon than you want, but we actually, as we introduce bills, we do also send out action alerts where we ask people to contact their legislators to support particular pieces of legislation. And so that will be coming once we reintroduce this bill, for you to reach out to both your members of your assembly and your Senate. As far as a letter to sign on to, what we often do with that is Audubon California will organize a letter and then circulate it to the chapters themselves, and then ask the chapters to sign on or give us their authority to put their logo on a thing. So we'll be doing that for that. And another bill that we'll be doing this year is increasing access to nature. We called it the human right to nature last year, and we'll be looking for support. That's basically finding ways to get more people outdoors, especially in nature-deprived communities and communities that have not had access to nature in the past. And that's a major Audubon value, and that'll be the other major piece of legislation we push this year. Should I just go down some of these questions here, Glenn?
Yeah, we're going to, I'll read them for you. The next one was, how do turbines affect burrowing owls? We heard a little bit of that last month from Sean Smallwood and Doug Bell.
I should have known it. I should have known there. You guys probably didn't mean to say half of what I said about the wind turbines. I'm sorry if I bored anybody.
Actually, they didn't talk that much about that. Sean and Doug didn't really talk about. They were really talking about burrowing owls. Although Sean's take on the repowering is that it has actually benefited burrowing owls for two reasons. One is that the new turbines are on sort of sheer poles. They're not on these like latticed metal stanchions, which raptors would perch on and hunt the burrowing owls. So there's some of the mortality for burrowing owls was actually from other raptors, and also the height that burrowing owls don't fly as high as other raptors generally, and so that seems to have actually had some there've been some positives so far. But this particular site is the sites where he has studied are sort of further removed from the densest places where burrowing owls are in the Altamont, and this site is immediately adjacent to the most dense burrowing owl colony.
Yeah, that's exactly. Obviously, it's right because Sean said it. So what do I know to say to ever disagree with Sean? But that point actually too, just about the lattice framework. And Glenn, let me know on time. I know we're on an hour, but when we put these artificial things into the environment, we don't always understand. And this is to my concern on offshore wind, like we don't know what disruptions we're going to cause until we start to actually observe them and study them. And so, for a long time, the conventional wisdom was, well, birds are getting killed because they're running into these turbines. Well, turns out, no, we're actually creating an artificial perch, which never was out there in the first place, or at least not for the last several hundred years. And it's allowing other birds to prey on the burrowing owls and wipe out certain colonies or create a high level of mortality that was not expected. So we just create these disruptions that we're not always sensitive to. So I think it's just really important. And that kind of goes to the question around solar. And, we need to study these things and understand how to mitigate them over time.
There was a question about whether, so there was a quick question about whether it was time to speak to the Board of Supervisors. In fact, we spoke to the Board of Supervisors. If you aren't subscribed to the GGAS chat, the Golden Gate Audubon listserv, you should join it, because that we actually gave notice of that meeting and invited people to speak at it, and a few people did. But it's always good to get more. And the next question was, should golden eagle deaths result in fines for the perpetrators?
Yeah, and they do. I mean, if there were, so what's happened actually under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is that, and what's usually been used in cases for oil spills, for example, is there's been very significant fines levied where there's been a high degrees of bird mortality as a result of what's called incidental take. So it's not like the person who spilled the oil went out there and like purposely meant to kill birds, but the death was foreseeable. So it was incidental to their negligence. In the same way, like a wind operator, they don't want to kill any birds, but they know they're going to every time they start those turbines. So yes, that can be very significant fines. The prosecution can be very difficult. And also politically, both DFW and Fish and Wildlife Service are very slow to prosecute renewable energy companies because they understand the need for renewable energy and the politics around that.
Let's see. There's another question about the offshore wind, and which we've mentioned. Can a technological aid to prevent eagle collisions with turbines is available? I think I'm blanking on the name.
Identiflight.
Identiflight, thank you. Yeah.
So there is a technology that's been used more so in plain states, so flatter areas, with a high degree of success. It's basically a radar. And as certain birds are approaching, the machine can identify that the birds are approaching and then send a signal to a turbine to shut it down. So it's no longer spinning until that species moves past it. They've tested that down in the Tehachapi Pass, where there are California condors actively flying in some turbine areas. And they're able to do that, and they think it's saved condors' lives. They have introduced it in the Altamont Pass because the level of mortality for eagles is so much higher than we were promised. And it's not like everything in the Altamont. It's like the Murphy's Law of bird conservation out there. It's not working. And probably it's not working because the Altamont is so hilly that the machine isn't detecting the birds. A lot of times the birds, sometimes to hide from prey, sometimes riding the wind, will be really low, and then they'll pop up at the last minute around a hill or a ridge and whack into a turbine, or the radar won't detect where the bird is. So they're still trying to do it. It's really unfortunate because, this shiny object of a technological fix is always really attractive to decision makers. And Brookfield is frankly using that to their advantage, where they're saying, well, we don't need to reduce the size of our project. We'll just use Identiflight because look at these numbers. It's worked elsewhere. It's got to work here. But actually, there's no indication that it will work here yet. We'd love for it to work. That'd be great. We'd love to get more energy out of Altamont Pass if it didn't kill so many birds. But again, there has to be a balance.
There's an interesting question from about whether, given the need for the urgent need for renewable energy, shouldn't offshore wind projects go forward with mitigations and research accompanying the projects rather than delaying them?
Well, they are sort of going forward anyway, and most of them are in federal land, so the control on them is even less limited than we have in some of these county areas. But I'll tell you, having talked to colleagues of mine that work on seabirds, folks, you might not believe this, we don't really understand as much as we want about terrestrial birds, where birds are on land in California. We have pretty good ideas, especially with earbird now and birders out all over the place. But there's a lot of actually baseline information the state still needs to make some good decisions. We have a fraction of that information on the ocean. And what we've also seen is where we have some predictability on land about where birds may be at any given time, say around a riparian area or wetland. Birds on the ocean move around due to winds and food resources and a lot of other factors. So predictability about where to put turbines to reduce impacts is much lower. So it's kind of a brand new frontier for this issue. So that said, we need renewable energy. I guess I think some of it's going to go forward and we're going to learn lessons as it's getting built. I think in high risk areas, for example, down on the Central Coast near Vandenberg Air Force, we have identified important bird areas in the offshore habitat. So I would suggest don't put these turbines that we don't know what they do yet in an important bird area. Pick an area that's, we know at least, is not as important to birds as these IBAs. That's at least the kind of precautionary principle that should be applied at the outset. The other thing is these companies who are billion dollar companies are going, they can afford to invest in the science to improve our understanding of these areas. We should not be cutting corners, at least to understand and reckon our impacts. Dan Taylor, who had my job for about 30 years before I got it, so I had some big shoes to fill, told me when we were going back and forth a bit on this issue, he said, you know, one of the great sins of the carbon era, the fossil fuel era, was that we allowed the oil companies and ourselves to externalize the costs associated, the environmental and the public health costs associated with fossil fuels. We put those impacts of the oil industry and what they've emitted onto wildlife, onto the environment, onto poor communities, onto disadvantaged communities, communities of color often. And we didn't reckon with that. We just put that weight and that burden on them. Can we do differently now as we transition to renewables, where we're not just putting the burden, allowing companies to externalize that as they maximize their profits? Can we do it in a way that still incentivizes the companies to make money on these in order to do it? And that's the fine balance. That's kind of the knob we keep kind of twist to figure out what that balance is.
Let's take one more question before we call it a night. This is another wind question. Are there significantly lower impacts to birds from the turbines in the Delta in Solano County?
Well, there are, yes. My understanding is basically the mortality in Altamont Pass is pretty much the worst in the country. Tehachapi Pass at certain times has the old turbines at Tehachapi maybe killed as many or more of some species. But the Altamont has sort of been considered the black eye on the wind industry for a long time. And actually, one of the kind of obscene things that's happened there is that back in the mid-2000s, there was universal agreement from the county, from other environmental groups, from the agencies, from other NGOs, that the level of take to golden eagles was unacceptable in other species. And so that pushed, there's a lot of support for our litigation, and it pushed change at the county and that promise to reduce avian mortality. But it seems like everybody's forgotten it, because here we are 15 years later, and the county is approving projects that's putting us on pace to kill about as many golden eagles as we were 15 years ago. And yes, there's a change in understanding about that we need renewables, but we're still, causing these local populations to be extirpated. So my understanding is elsewhere there are lower impacts, but we should still be identifying and mitigating for those. And then the challenge really is to figure out what we can do about the Altamont. And because Noreen asked a question, I'm going to cut you off, Glenn, because I have to answer any question Noreen asks me. I think that's probably a good idea, Noreen, about the question is, should there be a wind turbine mitigation fund like there is for oil spills? And the problem is that a lot of that for the oil spills comes on a surtax per barrel for oil that comes into California. And if we want to then put a surtax on the amount of energy generated from wind, I think that's a great idea. But I'll tell you, the wind companies will fight us on it. And there's probably a concern that additional cost will be passed on to consumers, and it could have a disproportionate impact on lower income consumers than others, because it's essentially a flat tax applied to everybody using the electricity. But I think we need to be looking at some things like that to figure out how we do long-term mitigation.
All right, well, thank you all of you and thank you to we got up to almost 140 people, which is pretty good. Thank you all, and thank you for the 80 something of you who stuck us out to the bitter end. Thank you, and thank you for your great questions. I'm sorry we missed a few, and I apologize to those of you whose questions didn't get answered. But I'll do my best to follow up with some answers for you. Do look for if you missed this and you want to catch the recording, it will be posted on our website. And You can also, our December goal is coming out in just a few weeks, and we'll put a little article about this presentation with all the links. So if you missed any link, we'll have it, just make sure you're signed up for the Eagle. And have a great evening and a great holiday. I won't see you again, all of you, until January, because Christmas Eve, I guess nobody wants to listen to me talk about birds. So so have a great holiday period. Stay safe, stay well. I look forward to seeing most of you at Christmas bird counts. I'm going to do all 3 this year. I may, come January, I may just kind of pass out, but I'm going to be doing 3 Christmas bird counts this year, so I'm pretty excited. So I hope to see you at one of them. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in the new year.